A punch to the gut is exactly how that night started. Ava, my girlfriend, folded in the hotel hallway like a broken thing when I told her I didn't want to take her back to my place after she smelled like drinks. She threw the line at me before I could explain, "You don't want me." Her voice snapped into pieces and then into hysterics. I booked the room because leaving her there alone felt worse than sharing a bed with someone on the edge. I held her while she cried and watched the moods flip so fast I couldn't breathe, 1 minute desperate, the next in anger that felt practiced. She shoved my hand toward her chest and barked, "Just take it," like it was a command. When I moved away gently, she folded up like tissue and whispered, "This is what I'm for. Men see this body and they take it." I cleaned her up after she vomited, handed her water, and she looked at me like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. That's how it began, the late-night calls and the drives through empty streets. Me showing up because she said she couldn't stop thinking about that night, her voice small and haunted at 1:30 a.m. I can't stop thinking about that night. I started showing up every time. The first weeks we stayed like that, talking until the street lights blued out, sitting in the car letting the engine tick while we tried to be less raw. 3 months later I was in all the way. Ava was the funniest person I knew. She could make light out of anything in a sentence, and I fell for her laugh the way a man clings to a life raft. But the cracks showed up in small, sharp ways. Compliment her and she would go cold. I'd say, "You're beautiful," and she'd look away like the words made her sick. Once she whispered, "Why don't you tell them I'm beautiful? Is something wrong with me?" As if beauty were a test I'd failed. Telling her I loved her mind made her physically ill. It didn't fit any rulebook I'd read. By month 5, the pattern had shifted into something else: panic, performance, accusation. I remember the argument about my phone like a separate weather system. She ripped off her dress in the middle of my living room and climbed on my lap like a machine doing exactly what it was told. When I reached for her and tried to talk about boundaries, she screamed, "Are you gay? Do you have someone else, someone prettier?" The words were weapons and salves at once. She would beg me to use her, to have sex to prove that she mattered, then collapse and tremble for hours saying, "I'm broken." I tried to hold her and set limits at the same time, and every time I tried to be reasonable, she turned it into a crisis. Her actions became theatrical, arriving at my office in tiny skirts on purpose, watching how men looked and then asking me to tell her I didn't notice. She measured coworker reactions like a score, then accused me of lying the moment I said I trusted her. The first time I felt manipulated, I froze. Not because I didn't want her, but because her crisis was so steady it had become the relationship's backbone. She used panic and reassurance like levers. She'd say something to explode, then expect me to fix the pieces she'd shattered. After a while, it wore me down. I learned to keep evidence in my head: what she did, when she did it, how she flipped from pleading to punishing. It felt awful to catalog the woman I loved the way I would a vending machine. Input a problem, expect a predictable output. But patterns are safer than chaos, so I started writing things down when she wasn't looking. There were nights when she was tender and real, when she let herself laugh until we both cried at something stupid on TV. Those nights made the other ones harder to swallow because they were proof she could be normal, could be kind. I clung to those moments and told myself love could fix the rest. But the more I held on, the more she escalated. She started calling me at odd hours, begging me to come over, insisting that if I didn't, it would mean I didn't want her. When I did go, she'd alternate between clinging and threatening, saying she'd hurt herself if I left, then accusing me of betrayal if I stayed and wasn't sufficiently worshipful. I slept on the couch more than in my bed, because sleep in that pile of sheets felt safer than sleep under the weight of her unpredictability. I tried to talk to friends, to say the right things and get advice, and their faces tightened in ways I hated. Set boundaries, they said. Document it, someone else said. Those were practical ideas, but in the moment they felt clinical and distant. Love doesn't come with an instruction manual, and my grief made me softer, more gullible. I didn't want to be a cop in my own life, I wanted to be her person. But every time I let that want guide me, I paid dearly. The night in the hotel corridor didn't feel like an outlier anymore. It felt like the opening chapter in a book I didn't want to finish reading. I kept answering the phone, I kept driving, I kept getting hurt. And I started saving everything because hope and fear are both a hell of a teacher. Arguments turned into performances, like she was rehearsing a play and I was the only audience member stuck in the front row. Once we were fighting about my phone, the kind of small thing that explodes because everything else is already raw, and she stopped mid-sentence, stripped, and climbed onto my lap like a machine carrying out a script. I remember thinking, this is not real, but she was real enough, warm and heavy and shaking. When I tried to set a boundary and said, "I love your mind," she snapped like a rubber band. "Are you gay? Do you have someone else?" she shouted, the words sharp and sudden. Then she begged me with that frantic voice, "Use me, prove it." I felt trapped between two rules: don't humiliate her, don't lie, don't hurt. I reached for the middle and she collapsed into sobs that lasted hours, shaking and whispering, "I'm broken. I held her, I comforted her, and in the quiet I wrote down the time and what she said, because the pattern made less sense if I didn't mark it somewhere. Her manipulations started small and then boldened like a river finding wider ground. She began testing me in public on purpose, showing up at my office wearing tiny skirts and heels and walking past my coworkers with a deliberate sway. She'd stand near my desk and watch faces while pretending to check her phone, then look at me with that expectant, accusing smile and say, "See, they look." It was a number game for her, how many glances, how slow the glances, who smiled, and she'd demand I prove jealousy was real by reacting exactly as she wanted. "Show me you care," she'd say, tapping my arm like a scoreboard. When I refused to play along, she read it as proof I didn't care and used that to fuel the next round of panic, accusations, or cruelty. The manipulation felt clinical, like she'd studied it and chosen tactics that hurt the most. I learned the shapes of her tactics by pain, humiliation, then pleading, then silence that felt like punishment, then threats. She weaponized my sympathy against me. If I comforted her, she'd later accuse me of enabling her lying or cheating. If I held firm, she'd say I was cold and uncaring. I began to understand that she wanted a specific response, a public proof of possession, a raw display of jealousy to validate herself. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. When I gave that response out of obligation, it felt like handing her coins for an empty vending machine. Nothing inside ever changed. Friends tried to help, but it's harder to be honest about being manipulated than it is to be honest about a broken bone. Set boundaries, they said again and again, as if boundaries were a bandage you could slap on and forget. Tell her you won't be manipulated. I wanted to, but every attempt felt like poking a nest. She responded to boundaries with theatrical collapse or fury, and the stakes escalated. She began accusing me of lying when I said I trusted her, as if my words were proof and my silence was evidence of guilt. Once I caught her filming a conversation, she'd staged it so a coworker would walk in and see us arguing. Later, she showed me the clip and said, "You don't make sense." The idea of reality shifted under my feet. I tried rehearsing calm responses like Dr. Lane later taught me, but back then my toolkit was raw and improvised. I'd say, "I'm not going to," and she'd cut me off with a kiss or a scream or a public scene that made me all the colors of wrong. When she begged me to use her to prove something, I refused because consent felt different when it was proof of love instead of an expression of it. That refusal became a proof she kept in her pocket, a reason to light another fire and watch me run with a bucket. Keeping evidence became survival. I started taking notes, saving voicemails, screenshotting texts, and time-stamping them. It felt voyeuristic and cold, cataloging the woman I loved like evidence for a case, but the more I recorded, the more I could see the pattern without fog. The manipulations were not accidental, they repeated with that same rhythm of demand and collapse. I realized she was testing not to connect, but to make sure she could break me when she needed rescue. That thought made me angrier than the shame of being manipulated. Sometimes, in the eye of the cyclone, she'd be tender and lucid, as if compelled to whisper the truth of why she'd done all of it. "I don't know how else to be loved," she said once in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug like armor. "This is all I know." I wanted to believe her. I wanted that to be the whole story, but words on a cold night and orchestrated scenes in public are different things. The test became the relationship, and the relationship started to feel less like a joining and more like a training ground for trauma. I stayed because love and grief both make you surrender in the same way, and I left pieces of myself behind in the margins, marked with the times of the arguments, the way her face folded, and the reasons I kept saying yes to staying. The night started like a countdown. Ava, my girlfriend, went quiet at dinner and then said flatly, "That's when you'll finally cheat." Her voice had that brittle edge that meant she'd already decided the ending. I shrugged and told her I wasn't going to let a party make our life into something ugly. She tapped her phone and sent me a Venmo for $3,800 with a note. "Just find someone tonight, I can't keep waiting." I stared at the screen, then stared at her. "I won't," I said. She smiled in a way that held no warmth and said, "Fine, I'll make it happen." She kissed me goodbye like she was closing a coffin lid and told me she was too sick to come. At the party, I tried to be normal. I said hello to people, I laughed at the right beats, I pretended my stomach was not a knot. We were in the dining room where the lights were too bright and the music sat under our feet like a hum. I crossed to the bar to get water and then it hit me, a smell I hadn't breathed since the funeral. Jasper Bloom, my sister's perfume, hit me like a hand to the chest. My knees went rubber. I stopped and looked up slow as if I might be wrong. Across the room, a woman stood like a memory wearing that exact scent, the same dark hair, the same tilt of head that my sister used to have when she laughed. My breath left me. She walked toward me like she belonged in the picture my brain had kept of my sister. Then the impossible happened. She called me by Jasmine's childhood nickname, Tommy Bear, and ran her finger along the old scar on my hand like it was a map she knew well. My lungs forgot how to work. Jasmine would want you to be happy, she murmured. The voice sounded syrupy, practiced. I turned and ran out the door without thinking, hands shaking hard enough to make the glass of water in my palm jump. Outside, the air was cold and my heart was a drum in my throat. I heard heels behind me and then she was there, close enough that I could smell the perfume again like the ghost had followed. She leaned in as if to kiss me, whispering she'd want you to be happy. Rage and grief collided in my chest and the sound that came out of me was raw. She's dead, I shouted. I shoved her away. Her face changed like someone had flicked a switch. She fumbled for her phone and showed me screenshots, receipts, messages, evidence of a plan I hadn't imagined. Lines of text said things like, call him Tommy Bear, touch the scar, wear this perfume. There were photos from my apartment, pictures of my desk, and a receipt that matched the Venmo transaction Ava had sent me weeks before. For a second, everything rearranged into a pattern. My grief had been bait, my memories weaponized. I felt my stomach drop into a pool of cold. I walked back inside with my hands in my pockets like I still had any dignity left. My head was full of questions. I cornered Ava in the hallway, voice shaking, and played the messages for her. She watched me like someone watching a show they'd already scripted. You were supposed to hurt me, she said quietly, almost proud. You were supposed to prove me right. I had a mouth full of words that turned into nothing. Why would you do this? I asked, and she smiled in the way that said the punch is coming next. She pulled something from her purse like a magician showing the final trick, a home pregnancy test with 2 lines. She held it up like a trophy and said, looks like you're stuck with me. My head spun. Dates blinked through my memory when the last time had been who was there when she'd thrown my laptop across the room over a message from a female coworker. We had not been intimate in 18 days. The numbers didn't add up. We should get blood work, I said, trying to keep my voice even, because panic would be proof to her that she'd won again. Her sweetness curdled like milk. She accused me of calling her a liar, of cheating, of wanting out. She waved the plastic stick like a flag. You think I'd lie? She demanded. I told her I wanted a clinic test. She refused and then called me cruel. I texted Adam at work because I needed someone else to know what was happening. He replied fast that he would come if I needed him. I could feel the grip of something like sanity returning simply because another person knew. I slept that night on the couch and locked the bathroom door for the first time in our relationship, which felt like betrayal and relief all at once. In the dark, I sorted my pockets and found the Venmo notification again on my phone. The numbers were a cold fact. I opened my notes app and started writing down times, what people said, and what I had seen at the party. My hands trembled as I typed. The world had shifted in one night from a party to a set of traps laid around my grief. I felt both furious and filthy, as if someone had stolen a piece of my dead sister and sold it back to me. The name Jasper Bloom floated in my head like a taunt, and I promised myself I wouldn't let them make my sister's memory into a weapon anymore. The woman's smirk felt designed to hurt. She held up her phone like an accusation, flipping through photos of my apartment, screenshots of receipts, and messages with clear instructions. Call him Tommy Bear, touch the scar, wear Jasper Bloom. My stomach dropped like someone kicked it out from under me. My sister's memory had been turned into bait in a script, and I could feel my hands go cold as I realized how carefully it had been planned. Who sent you this? I asked, voice thin. She shrugged and said, Ava did, she paid me. The word paid landed like a stone. I marched back inside, every step heavy, and found Ava leaning in a corner like she'd been waiting for me to come apart. I put the phone between us and played the messages. You were supposed to hurt me, she said after a beat, smiling like someone who just watched the perfect scene finish. It was not sorrow I heard in her voice. It was a kind of triumph that tasted like metal. You were supposed to prove me right, she added, eyes cold. I felt air leave me in a soundless rush. Why would you do that? I asked, and my words sounded stupid even to my own ears. Her smile didn't falter. Then she pulled a small white stick from her purse and held it up like proof of victory. 2 clear lines. Looks like you're stuck with me, she said, like she was handing me a verdict. My mind started lining up dates and events, how long since we'd been intimate, the argument where she'd thrown my laptop, the 17 or 18 days that didn't fit. I felt like I'd been set in a maze and the walls just moved. I said, we need to confirm this with blood work, at a clinic, together. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled. If this was real, we needed facts. If it was not, we needed the truth on paper. Her face did something I couldn't read. For a second she was sweet, the Ava who made me laugh until I cried. You think I would fake this? She asked, eyes narrowing like a shield. When I said I wanted to go to a clinic, she turned sharp immediately. Are you calling me a liar? She demanded, and the room tightened. She waved the test at me like a flag. When I tried to explain calmly, I need to know the dates line up, she lashed out, accused me of suspecting her of cheating, of wanting out. The old script repeated. Anything that threatened her narrative of being undesired turned into an attack, and I was put on trial. I texted Adam at 2 in the morning because I needed someone else to hear this. He replied, "Tell me where you are, I can come." Knowing someone else knew, the mess kept me from spinning out entirely. I slept on the couch for the first time in weeks, and when I closed my eyes, the apartment felt like a courtroom. The next morning, I tried to be careful. I called the clinic and booked a blood test for the three of us. Ava began to pace like an animal that knows a trap is near. I told her the appointment time and asked her to come with me. She agreed, then changed her mind, then agreed again with a kind of hysterical softness that made my chest ache. On the drive to the clinic, my hands were a foreign thing on the wheel. I rehearsed what I'd say, calm, factual, no accusations. I wanted tests, not drama. I imagined a lab tech saying, "not pregnant," and everything snapping back to where it had been. I also imagined the opposite and didn't want to know the weight that would bring. When we got there, Ava's face crumpled at the sight of the waiting room. She said she couldn't handle needles, that the whole thing would be too much. Her breathing went shallow, and I could see panic knitting her fingers. A clinic employee asked if she wanted a moment, and she bolted, like someone who had practiced escape routes. I sat in the empty parking lot afterwards with my head against the steering wheel, feeling stupid for hoping this would be simple. I had walked in thinking we'd get a clear answer and walk out with a plan. Instead, she had left, and all that remained were questions. I called Adam and told him what happened. He said we should get copies of everything and tell HR later if we needed to. I started pulling my phone out and opening the evidence folder I'd been keeping for weeks, the screenshots, the voicemails, the receipts. It felt obscene and necessary both at once. Back at the apartment, the silence was a thing with teeth. Ava texted me a dozen messages in a row, sweetness, threats, please, until I had to block and save them like fossils. The fight shifted from the clinic to the phone and then to the internet. The one thing that steadied me was the evidence I had begun to collect: timestamps, names, money trails. If I wanted the truth, I had to treat it like something outside of my feelings. Grief had made me vulnerable. Documentation might be what pulled me back into the world. I didn't know then if the test was true. I only knew I needed facts, and I was finally willing to demand them. She exploded the minute I said blood work, waving the test like it was a weapon and yelling, "You think I'd lie? You think I fathered a child with someone else?" Her voice bounced off the walls, equal parts fury and hurt. I held up my hands because arguing louder wouldn't prove anything. "I just want facts," I said. "If it's real, we'll deal with it together. If it's not, we need to know." She didn't hear the calm, she heard accusation. She kept yelling until the words turned thin. I texted Adam, my coworker, because he'd been at the company party and I needed someone who knew the context to be awake and ready. "Something happened at the event. I need you," I typed. His reply came faster than I expected. "On my way if you need me, tell me where." That was the smallest thing that mattered that night. Someone else knowing the truth felt like a rope thrown into the dark. I slept on the couch for the first time in a long while, not because I wanted to leave her, but because the bed felt like a shared battleground. In the quiet, I started doing the thing that felt both desperate and sane. I began collecting evidence. I opened my phone and made a folder called Evidence. I pulled screenshots into it, messages, receipts, Venmo notes. I saved voice memos where she'd screamed and where she'd sobbed. I labeled them with the date and time. I kept the Venmo screenshot that showed the $3,800 and the note that said, "Just find someone tonight." It felt cold and transactional to drag my life into a folder, but it also felt like reclaiming control. When grief is weaponized, details become shields. By morning, I had already refunded the payment she'd sent and moved the transaction into the evidence folder. I wrote down every small thing I could remember from the party: what the woman in the perfume had said, the scar being traced, the nickname. Names and times and receipts started to stitch themselves into a pattern that looked less like my imagination and more like a plan. I kept thinking of my sister's face and how ugly it felt that someone would use her memory as bait. The anger behind that feeling made me more methodical than I had been the night before. Within an hour, a message popped up on my phone from a woman named Maya, an actress, who said she regretted what she'd done. When I read the text, my chest unclenched just a little. She wrote, "I'm so sorry, I was paid to do it. I can put what I did in writing." I asked her to say it plainly, who hired her, what she was paid, what she was told to do. She answered with a list, times, receipts, even a small video where she admitted Ava had coached her on the nickname and the perfume. Holding that message felt like finding the corner of a rug to pull. The rest of the room trembled with what would come up. I called Adam and read him the messages out loud. He listened and said, "Get copies, don't delete anything, tell HR if you need to." His calm was practical and necessary. Knowing a coworker was ready to back me up made the idea of going to HR less like betrayal and more like using a system that might finally protect me. I printed screenshots and saved voicemail files into 2 separate hard drives, one at home and one at a safe place a friend could access if I needed. The process felt invasive but right. By noon, I had a folder full of timestamps and digital fingerprints that no single person's memory could erase. Maya sent a short written confession to my phone and agreed to speak with anyone who needed the truth. That alone shifted the angle of everything, from my private grief to a public act of manipulation. The truth was assembling into a record that looked like evidence, not histrionics. I felt a slow spin of relief and rage in the same space. It was relief because I could finally point to things that were testable. It was rage because someone had used my sister as a tool. I messaged Ava to tell her I was organizing things and that I wanted medical confirmation. She answered with a string of messages that moved from honeyed apologies to threats, the old cycle compressing into a violent loop. I saved every line. This is what it meant to be careful, document, hold back, and let facts speak. I didn't know where this would end, court, HR, a police report, but I did know I was no longer letting my gut be the only jury. I was creating a paper trail, and for the first time since the perfume hit me in the dining room, I could see a way forward that wasn't controlled by someone else's theatrics. I told Adam everything because he'd been at the party and because he was the one who said I shouldn't handle this alone. Adam, my coworker, insisted it had to be reported to HR since the whole thing had happened at a company event. "You can't let this slide," he said. "They need to know for future events for safety." His voice was firm in a way I needed, and his being on my side made me feel less crazy. I agreed and set up a meeting with HR. Geeta, the HR representative, met with me in a small room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. I sat across from her and felt like I was opening a wound with words. I played Maya's recorded confession on my phone for Geeta and handed over the screenshots of messages that gave explicit instructions. Use the nickname, touch the scar, wear the perfume. I watched Geeta's face change as the recording played. She looked disturbed, caught off guard by how deliberate it all was. "We'll document this," she said, steady and practical. "We'll open an investigation." Hearing that gave me a small, sharp relief because finally someone was treating it like more than a private mess. Geeta asked for everything I had and then told me to save every communication from then on. She suggested I forward any emails or messages Ava might send to a secure HR inbox. I did what she asked and felt like a patient following orders in a life-or-death drill. HR began routing Ava's work emails through their team so nothing would go directly to my manager or me without an official record. That felt invasive and also protective. "We'll take care of vendor checks, event safety, and witness statements," Geeta said, "and we'll keep this confidential within the limits of the investigation." Her calmness made the whole thing feel less absurd and more actionable. The HR investigation gave me structure. They asked for names, times, receipts, and witness accounts. I gave them everything: Maya's statement, the Venmo screenshots, the photos of receipts, and the voice memos I'd saved. Geeta typed as I talked and occasionally stopped me to get a detail right. I watched the words I used turn into a record. It felt strange to see my private grief laid out in bullet points, but it also made me feel less alone. HR offered to speak to the vendor and to the event planners and to interview anyone who might have seen the woman in the perfume. They moved faster than I expected. When HR started asking about how I was doing, I realized I needed help beyond paperwork. Adam recommended a therapist, and that's how I found Dr. Lane, my therapist. Dr. Lane listened while I spilled the whole mess: my sister's death, the hotel hallway, the perfume, the nickname, and Ava's escalating manipulation. He didn't tell me to get over it. Instead, he helped me understand how grief had made me vulnerable. "Grief narrows your world," he said plainly. "It makes you reach for anything that feels familiar, even if it's dangerous." That line hit me like a slap I didn't know I needed. In sessions, Dr. Lane taught me grounding tools for panic attacks. He had me practice breathing exercises and sensory checks. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear. He told me to carry a small bracelet I could fidget with when the perfume hit me and to rehearse short, calm responses when someone tried to trigger me. We role-played a few scenarios where someone used a name or a smell to push me toward panic, and he coached me on how to step back without losing my mind. It felt weird at first, like practicing for a play, but the tools worked when I needed them. Dr. Lane also helped me separate my grief for my sister from the chaos Ava caused. "You love Jasmine," he said, "and you're allowed to protect that love from being used." He taught me to recognize manipulation for what it was, an attempt to control my response, and to answer with short, factual statements instead of emotion. That was harder than it sounded. Old habits of apologizing and explaining died slow, stubborn deaths. But with practice, I started to feel less like a puppet, and more like someone who could choose not to pull the strings. HR kept me updated on their investigation. Geeta told me they had interviewed witnesses and were gathering statements from vendors. They thanked me for coming forward because it helped them create better safety rules for company events. That recognition felt oddly validating. It wasn't just about me being right, it was about changing a system so others wouldn't be targeted the same way. Piece by piece, the chaos at least had begun to look like something I could manage. I had allies on paper and in person, and a therapist who helped steady me when my old memories pushed too hard. That combination, documented proof, and a plan for my panic started to make the dark smell of jasper bloom less paralyzing. I still breathed shallow when I thought of my sister, but I could hold the breath and let it out rather than letting it control me. Ava didn't stop. When HR began asking questions, she flipped to online warfare, emailing my boss with long accusations and forwarding blurry images that looked like lab results. Her messages were dramatic and reckless, accusing me of abuse and betrayal in ways that made my coworkers uncomfortable. I remember my manager's face when he forwarded me one of her emails, part pity, part confusion. I saved every message he sent me and saved every reply I wrote, careful not to sound defensive in writing. It felt like walking a tightrope where one wrong step might undo the work HR was doing. She started posting things, two blurry screenshots of lab images, photos that looked like pregnancy tests, and long, wordy emails meant to whip up sympathy. The pictures were low quality and inconsistent. Later, we learned many of them were edited or taken from public sources. That realization made my stomach flip. Someone had faked medical evidence to trap me. I saved every file anyway. Screenshots, voice notes, timestamps. If she wanted to play with reality, I was going to build a record that kept me tethered to the facts. The evidence folder grew fat and ugly on my laptop, but it became my armor against the spinning stories. Maya messaged HR directly and put her confession in writing. She told them she'd been paid to act and to use my sister's name, and she agreed to be interviewed. Sailor, another witness, a vendor's assistant, gave a formal statement saying Ava had hired her to help plan the impersonation. Hearing them speak the truth in sterile HR language felt like watching a broken thing get glued back together. Their statements matched the receipts and the Venmo trail I'd saved, and seeing the pieces line up was a relief that came with a bitter aftertaste. HR moved faster after witnesses came forward. Geeta and her team interviewed vendors, pulled cameras where they could, and started writing up reports. They also routed Ava's work communications through HR so nothing could land on my manager's desk without an official record. That small bureaucratic move felt huge. It stopped the barrage of messages and put a buffer between my life and the chaos Ava was trying to send into it. HR also thanked me for reporting the incident because it exposed holes in event screening and response. That felt strange to hear, gratitude for being targeted, but it also felt constructive. I began to pull my life back in practical ways. I tightened privacy settings on social media, blocked numbers, and created a separate email for anything work-related that might be contaminated with false messages. I printed the receipts and saved them in a locked drawer. Friends like Adam, my coworker, helped me draft event safety suggestions for HR, stricter vendor vetting, mandatory name checks for performers, backstage escorts, and quiet rooms for anyone who needed to leave an event without drama. We turned my panic into policy recommendations. HR took many of our suggestions and wrote them into the new procedures, which felt like a small victory that might keep someone else from being hurt. There was a moment when things escalated and I had to act. Ava posted a photo of pill bottles online next to a note that read like a suicide threat. I didn't hesitate. I called a welfare check. The police came, talked to her, and took her to a hospital for evaluation. It was terrifying to watch someone I loved in handcuffs of their own making, but it also meant professionals were involved and she received immediate help. I saved the police report and the hospital discharge note in my evidence folder. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about, but I felt steadier with those documents on file. Therapy with Dr. Lane kept me steady through it all. He taught me to notice my triggers and to use short, factual replies instead of getting pulled into the whirlwind of accusations. I practiced those responses over and over until they felt less like scripts and more like shields. My friends watched my back. Adam came to meetings with HR when I asked, and he helped me push for vendor checks and name tag systems at future events. Those practical steps gave me a kind of public safety I hadn't known I needed. The months after were not tidy or clean, but they were quieter. Ava's messages slowed after HR intervened and the police checked in. The fake lab images were debunked in official documentation. I kept saving everything because evidence had proven its worth. Slowly, I started to let normal things back into my day, cooking, reading, small plans that didn't feel like traps. Grief still lived in me, a dull ache I carried like a stone, but it was no longer a tool someone else could use. I had rebuilt borders around my life, lined them with records and witnesses, and learned who would stand with me when the world tried to reshape itself into a story I didn't believe. Therapy with Dr. Lane became my toolbox. He's my therapist, and he didn't sugarcoat anything. In session, we practiced short responses I could use when Ava tried to drag me into drama. I won't engage, I'm not answering that, we'll handle this through HR. He made me say them until they felt normal and not like some cowardly script. You need a roof over your words, he told me once, and the image stuck. The practice helped me stop explaining myself into exhaustion, which felt like learning to breathe with both lungs again. He also pushed on boundaries in ways I resisted at first. We role-played scenes where a person pushed guilt, threatened suicide, or tried to shame me for setting limits. I learned to refuse guilt without being cruel, how to say no and leave the room, how to hang up and document the moment. Short, firm, factual, he said, and the rhythm of that clipped language started to keep panic from taking over. When my chest tightened at the scent of Jasper Bloom or the nickname Tommy Bear, I'd reach for those phrases like a lifeline. Dr. Lane had me do exercises that were part memory work, part ritual. He asked me to visit the parks and coffee shops where my sister and I had spent time, places I'd been avoiding because grief had turned them into traps. The first time I went back to the pier where we used to watch the sunset, I felt like I'd walked into an old photograph. I sat on a bench where we had once shared a bag of fries and wrote a letter to Jasmine. The letter wasn't for anyone else. It was a map of what I remembered and what she meant to me. When I burned it in a small safe container on my balcony, the flame felt like permission to keep the memory and not let it be corrupted by Ava's cruelty. Part of reclaiming Jasmine's memory was removing objects that had become evidence and relic at the same time. I had kept the perfume bottle as proof, a heavy see-through thing on my shelf, but one night I realized it was a shrine to someone else's manipulation. I wrapped it up and threw it away. I felt a small, mean relief when the bottle hit the bottom of the dumpster. It was absurdly practical. One less sensory trigger in the apartment, one less physical link to a night that had been weaponized against me. Documentation became routine, not obsession. My private notebook followed me everywhere: dates, times, exact words, how long each episode lasted, who was there. I labeled entries, kept a digital folder with backups, and made passwords that only I knew. It felt like boring work, but it was also reclaiming the narrative. When I read back through the notes, I could see how patterns repeated and how I changed my responses over time. That record kept me honest and useful when HR asked for specifics. After HR intervened and witnesses gave statements, the noise dropped. Ava messaged once months later, short and clinical, "I'm in therapy twice a week." I didn't reply. I saved the message though because it was another piece of the story. Not answering felt like a boundary I finally meant. It didn't mean I wanted her harm, I wanted distance so I could heal. Letting that message sit in my archive felt cleaner than any reply could have. The institutional support mattered. HR had created policies to prevent repeats, and their paperwork meant the company treated this as serious. That backing made it easier to feel safe at work again. People who had been confused stopped asking awkward questions, and my manager stopped forwarding every email that could be fuel for drama. Adam still checked in. He came by with coffee sometimes and listened while I unloaded the small things. Those ordinary gestures, coupled with the formal record, built a buffer around my life. At home, I started doing simple, good things for myself. I cooked dinner more often, kept the radio low, and read books that had nothing to do with what happened. I made plans that didn't require an alibi. Grief was still there, sharp in certain moments, but it wasn't a weapon anymore. I could look at photos of Jasmine and feel both the ache and the warmth without the phantom of Ava's script creeping in. I breathed without thinking of a nickname or a perfume. Reclaiming my life didn't happen in a day, but it happened. Boundaries that once felt mean now felt like rails that kept me steady. The evidence I'd collected was not just proof against manipulation, it was proof that I had the right to safety and truth. I kept going to therapy, kept the notebook updated, and slowly let small joys back into my routine. The apartment stayed quiet in a good way. I learned that reclaiming a memory means protecting it from being used against you, and that sometimes the bravest thing is to keep living small, honest days. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.